it's Miss Sarah from the West Baton Boys and Girls Club again, and this week we're going to start a book called The Dreadful Fate of Jonathan York. It's a story about a guy that's been living a pretty boring life and a big adventure that he goes on in the swamps of a sinister island. All right, so we're going to get started. Jonathan York was lost in the gloom of a wilderness he had never experienced before and had hoped he would never experience at all. Poor Mr. York. The shortcut through the swamp had seemed like a good idea in the afternoon, but that was when the sun was bright in the summer sky. Now was different. The sun was sinking and the evening shadows had sidled in like predators seeking out the sick animals in a herd. A toad hopped into the middle of the path and stared at Mr. York with stern golden eyes. Mr. York stopped and stared back. "What have I done to deserve this dreadful fate?" he asked the toad. "I have always been such a harmless fellow. Truly, I have. I was splendidly behaved as a child and pleasantly well-mannered when I attended Brockleport Community College." He crouched down to the toad's level, and when he spoke again, his voice reached the pitch of an actor in a podunk theater troupe. "So why must a mild person such as me, a humble clerk at the Brockleport General Store, be doomed to wander this accursed swamp?" The toad blinked and hopped into the undergrowth. Mr. York stood and glanced around sheepishly. Lost a few hours and already he was talking to amphibians. It was getting darker and a steady drizzle was sifting through the canopy. Mr. York shuddered. His chances of finding his way out of the swamp before nightfall seemed slimmer by the minute. Just as the last daylight fizzled, he heard something on the path ahead. Footsteps! And judging by the sound, more than just one set. His neck prickled. He wasn't sure if he should run hopefully toward the footsteps or frantically away from them. In the end, he didn't run at all. He simply stayed rooted where he stood, unable to make up his mind as the strangers emerged from the shadows. There were 3 of them, and Mr. York was relieved to see they at least looked human enough. One was a woman of medium height clad in a hooded robe. Another was a tall, gangly man with wild hair. And the third was odd, to say the least. Mr. York raised his hand in a meager half wave. "Hello, my name is Jonathan York." His voice cracked as he said it. The hooded woman waved back. "Nice to meet you, Mr. York." Mr. York swallowed. His throat clicked. "I don't wish to trouble you, but I'm lost, you see, and I should very much like to find my way out of the swamp before it gets too dark." The lanky fellow shook his head. "No such luck, Mr. York. Your best bet is to spend the night at the Canterbury Inn and get a start in the morning." "Canterbury Inn? Where's that?" "Down the trail a bit," said the hooded woman. "We're heading there now. You're welcome to join us." Mr. York heaved a sigh of relief. He wasn't too keen on staying in some inn with a gaggle of strangers, but it was certainly better than wandering the darkness in an alien swamp. The party moved onward, walking single file and never speaking. Mr. York plodded along behind them, his head down and his head jammed into his pockets. The swamp was now alive with the sound of its nocturnal denizens. Some noises were familiar. The rasping of katydids, mixed in were voices Mr. York did not recognize. Guttural groans and shrieks and growls, sinister hisses and gurgles and snarls. He was glad to be traveling with a group. The party stopped abruptly, and the hooded woman pointed to a smaller overground trail sneaking off the path. Through the trees, they could see a light. They took a smaller trail and soon found a clearing, in the center of which was a weathered old house. The shingles were cracked and warped, and the rain had stripped away the paint years ago. They approached the door, and the hooded woman gave a timid knock. No answer. She knocked again, this time harder. Still no answer. Finally, after a third knock, there was a shuffling sound, and the door creaked open. A little old man squinted out at them. He scrunched his face and adjusted the spectacles perched on his nose. He held a lantern, which he thrust forward, almost offensively. "Yes?" he asked in a voice as creaky at the door. "What do you want?" The hooded woman dipped her body in what may have been a curtsy. "We beg your pardon, good sir, but is this not the Canterbury Inn?" The old man scratched and possibly picked the rim of his right nostrils. "It is? What of it?" "Well, it's dark and raining, and my fellow travelers and I have no desire to pass through the swamp on a night such as this." The old man rolled something between his fingers and flicked it aside, so it wasn't merely a scratch, thought Mr. York. Try not to make a face. "And you expect me to give you each a room so you may rest your weary carcasses?" grumbled the old man. "If you please, sir," said the hooded woman. "Huh. I don't know. There's been strange folk on the prowl lately. Nasty folk. Thieves and scoundrels. How am I to know you four won't rob me blind during the night? Perhaps you're even in cahoots with that awful West Bleakport gang." The lanky man, growing impatient. "Are you going to give us a room or not?" Before the old man could give his final word, another voice answered from within the house. "Of course we will!" An old lady appeared behind the man. "And we'll be happy to do so, won't we, Mortimer?" The old man crinkled his face at her. "Aye, it seems we will, as long as they pay, that is." Panic swept through Mr. York's scrawny frame. Pay? Suddenly dawned on him that he was not carrying any cash. "What's the price?" he asked. His voice cracked again, and he blushed. I don't have any money with me." "Money? What use have we for money? The wife and I have all we need in this house, plus the well for water and a coop for eggs." "But you said there was a price." "Aye, there is," said the old lady, "and it's something each of you can afford. But enough of that now. It's dark. You don't want to be out in Half Rock Swamp after dark." "Why?" Mr. York asked before he could stop himself. "What's out there?" The old lady turned to Mr. York with a disturbing gleam in her eyes. "Because, young man, Half Rock Swamp is a place of nightmares. There's squeevleagues and gluggerslogs and lackadills. There's gwunpods and lacerating manti and even all-absorbing shutherlurk. And that's just the beginning. I won't even mention the horror that dwells on the northeast edge. Now, enough of that grim talk. Please come to the kitchen for some supper." She led them into a cramped kitchen and dished out bowls of lumpy stew. Mr. York might have passed on the meal under normal circumstances, but trudging through the swamp had roused his appetite. The stew tasted strange, but was somehow satisfying. After they finished their dinner, the old man shuffled in and took a seat at the head of the table. He lit his pipe and sat puffing with an expression that might have meant contentment or annoyance. It was hard to read a face so scrunched. They sat in uncomfortable silence what seemed like an hour, but was really no more than 10 minutes. Finally, the man cleared his throat and spoke. "The time has come to collect your payment. Now, as I mentioned, my wife and I have our needs met and therefore no use for material goods. Instead, we ask you pay us in stories." "Stories?" said the lanky man. "Yes, stories. One per guest. We live alone out here in the swamp, and although I don't care much for company, I do enjoy listening to stories. Particular particularly stories of adventure that take me back to my younger days when I had many stories of my own. Mr. York's stomach churned. Stories? The old man was making them pay with stories? Mr. York feared public speaking almost as much as he feared death and pestilence, and the thought of sharing a story with strangers made cold beads of sweat pop out of his forehead. All right, guys, that's where we're going to stop for this week, and next week we'll finish and see what kind of stories the travelers told. And until then, make sure you're reading on your own and think of what awesome stories you might be able to share. See you next week.